This is the last lecture for the book Siddartha by Hermann Hesse. It's for chapters 9 through 12. Don't forget that you are to be filling in your hero's journey if I've asked you to do that. And also that you are filling in your Siddartha journey map as well. You're going to put in everything on the Siddartha's journey map. One thing that I keep forgetting to tell you to put on the map, which I'm assuming that you know to do since it's in the legend, is I want you to make sure you put in where all the characters come in. That's going to be one of the questions I'm going to ask you. I've already kind of asked you in session 2. I said, why is it that Govinda can come on the flesh slide in By the River? And I'm going to expand on that question towards the end of this session. All right. We've saw in the last session that Siddartha realizes that something to do with is going to bring him enlightenment. The losing himself, having that kind of false death, hearing the not saying the which is what he tried to do in the Rituals of the Spirit, chapter 1, but as he's saying it, hearing it, and also looking into the river at the same time. Sight and sound equals wisdom. He hears that and he realizes something, and that wisdom says to stay by the river. Okay, and here we have in chapter 9, in his heart he heard the voice speaking, the newly awakened voice, that is the bird that was in the cage, and it said to him, love this water, stay here, learn from it. Oh yes, he wanted to learn from the water. He wanted to listen to it. Whoever understood this water and its secrets, it seemed to him that person would understand much else, many secrets. All secrets. When you hear that, you see that word all and many, you're thinking of the word every, you're thinking of the word unity, which is what this last section, this last triad of chapters is all about. Now, Vasudeva kind of echoes this. Vasudeva, we've seen that name before. Remember, Vasudeva is that form of Vishnu in which everything exists, unity. And we find out that we've already met Vasudeva. Vasudeva was the ferryman. All this time, everything comes back. That was Vasudeva. How interesting. And Vasudeva confirms what Siddartha has learned already from the river. You will learn how, Vasudeva said, but not from me. The river taught me how to listen. From the river, you too will learn how. It knows everything. The river. One can learn everything from it. Now, go back to the first triad. Siddartha says, I'm going to give up having teachers and mentors. And he does. He has no more spiritual teachers. His father's not going to teach him. The ascetic, the old man, is not going to teach him. The Buddha can't teach him. He can learn from peers. That would be okay from him. In this case, though, he's not even going to learn from a peer. He's not going to learn from Vasudeva. He's going to learn from things. And going back to the first triad of chapters, that's one of the things that Siddartha realized, is that he has to learn to love things. Remember when he shed his skin there in chapter 4, he said, all this time I thought that mountains and green grass and animals, I didn't look at anything because I thought it was illusion. But now I'm going to start looking at it. Now he's gone beyond the second triad. He's looked at them, but now in this third triad of chapters, he's going to actually love them. All right, let's see what the actual lessons from the river are. Lesson 1 that he has, and by the way, you may number these differently. This is just as I'm writing things down from the book. I have that the water ran on and on. It always ran, and yet it always was there. It was always and ever the same, and yet at every moment new. So I think of that as being that the river is eternal. Now, this river is obviously a symbol. So whatever this river represents, it's eternal. It's always there. It's always been. It always will be. Kind of almost like that statement about God that you hear about omnipresence. Sorry, we're going to get the omnipresence later, but this is the eternality of the river. Lesson 2. Above all, he learned how to listen, to hearken with a quiet heart, with a soul that waited open, without passion, without desire, without judgment, without opinion. So listening without self. All right, so that's very important. We said that sight and sound equals wisdom. Here's the sound. He's got to learn how to listen, not just listen, but listen correctly. Lesson number 3, time does not exist. For the river, only the present exists. No shadow of the past, no shadow of the future. All right, so not only is the river eternal, but it's eternal in one moment. It's eternal always in the present. Always live for the present. Okay, and so these are the 3 lessons so far that we learned from the river, but we're going to have 6 altogether. Lesson 4. All the voices of creation are in its voice, and when you succeed in hearing all its 10,000 voices at the same time, you hear Om. So not only is the river eternal, but only in one moment, so to speak, but all of the different voices that you hear in it, the river obviously is life itself, all the voices that have ever lived, ever will live, all the different types of lives. When you listen to it all at once, you hear Om, that word of completion. By the way, the word Om in Hinduism is said at the beginning and end of prayers. So it kind of connects the prayer, so to speak, in a circle, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. The 5th lesson, the river laughed. Yes, it was so. It all came back. Everything not suffered through to the end and resolved. The same woes were suffered again and again. And this reminds me of what Vasudeva said back then in chapter 5 about how the river, everything comes back. He's learned this from the river. Siddartha is now learning this. That if you don't learn from the river, you will learn from the river eventually. That wheel of reincarnation exists so that you will find perfection. If you don't find it in this life, you'll find it in the next life. But you will find perfection. Very interesting, huh? This is the final lesson, the one that kind of sums it all up. Everything was one. Everything was interwoven and intricately knotted, 1,000-fold. And everything together, all the voices, all the goals, all the yearning, all the suffering, all the desire, everything good and evil. Everything all together was the world. Everything all together was the flow of events, was the music of life. And if Siddartha listened attentively to this river, to this song of 1,000 voices, if he did not listen to the pain or the laughter, if he did not bind his soul to any one voice and enter in with his eye, but rather listen to all. Remember that heron, how he is putting his eye, his soul into the heron? He's got to learn not to do that, to just listen to everything all at once, not one thing at a time. So let me go back. Enter into it with his eye, but rather listen to all, the entirety, perceiving the unity. Then the great song of the 1,000 voices consisted of one single word, and the word was perfection. So how did the Buddha find enlightenment? The Buddha found enlightenment by knowing, hearing everything all at once, experiencing everything all at once. Now, we're experiencing everything, and it's really love that's doing it. We found love, and from love we loved a thing, the river, and from the river we heard everything. So love is really the most important idea. And Siddartha says this towards the end of the book, a couple pages from the end. He says, "Love, O Govinda, seems to me the matter principle, foremost of all, the most important thing, ! To see through the world, to explain it, to hold it in contempt. These may be matters for great thinkers." Well, that's what we do. We great thinkers, isn't it? We divide the world. We have all these structures, cause, effect. We make little divisions on things. He says, don't do that. That's wrong. Put it all together. Take it like pieces of clay and stick it up into one big ball of different colors. One thing. He says, these may be matters for great thinkers, but the one thing that concerns me is the ability to love the world, not to hold it in contempt, not to hate it and myself, to be able to regard it and myself and all beings with love and admiration and reverence. So to see myself in the world. Now think about going back to session 2. I talked a little bit about Atman and how Atman is kind of this personless thing that's in everything and we're in it and we kind of lose ourselves in it. That's kind of what he's saying with love. He's saying that we have to love everything. We have to recognize ourselves in everything. We have to recognize that everything is worthy of love. And he'll explain the idea a little bit later on. But how did we get there? We started off with Siddartha loving the water. It enchanted him, he says, how grateful he was to it. So the first thing Siddartha learns to love is a thing, a river. And then the next thing Siddartha learned to love, he sat and looked at Vasudeva and remembered how back on the final day of his time as a samana, love for this man had stirred his heart. So remember, Vasudeva, well, he may not be this in the book, but we think of Vasudeva as one of the forms of Vishnu. So he starts off with loving a thing, and then he goes to loving a god, or loving the life preserver, so to speak. All right. And not only that, we see that the Buddha did the same thing. Siddartha says to the Buddha, I know that I am at one with Gautama. How then should he too not know love? He who has recognized all humanity in its transience, in its nothingness, and has yet so greatly loved humankind that he has devoted a lifelong full of toil, has devoted a long life full of toil exclusively to helping them, to teaching them. So we find out that yes, indeed, the Buddha must have loved as well. Isn't that interesting? So I said in session 1 that we were going to take Siddartha, our character, and Siddartha the Buddha. We connected them from trees at the very beginning. Then we were going to separate them. And then I also said at the end of the book, we're going to bring them together. And here we have them connected together, connected through love. But not just love. What is the Buddha known for? He's known for his smile. We're going to see that Siddartha also has that same smile of the Buddha. We'll get to that later. So through lips and through love, very interesting. Anyway, while Govinda thought thus, and a conflict occurred in his heart, he bowed again to Siddartha, drawn by love. Now, Siddartha was drawn by love to the river, and that's how he found enlightenment. He finds enlightenment actually in chapter 11, doesn't he? But he doesn't find total completeness. Here we have Govinda now also being drawn to love, but not love to the river. Because remember, it doesn't matter if you love the river or you love something else. You can find this in anything. You just have to love something and see everything in that thing. Govinda sees everything in Siddartha, and he's drawn by love. But while Govinda, in bewilderment and nonetheless drawn by great love and anticipation, obeyed his words, bowing near him, to him, and touching his forehead with his lips, there's our lips motif, something wonderful happened to him, to Govinda. A certain contempt for his friend's words battled within him against a terrible love and awe. Notice how many times the word love appears there. Just as Siddartha has found love, so it appears that Govinda has too. And just as Siddartha has something going on with his lips, that smile that's now radiant, we see now that Govinda is using his lips to touch perfection, not to speak it, but so that he can see it. Sight and sound equal wisdom. All right, well, Govinda becomes enlightened, doesn't he? Here's our diagram of our chapters. We have a spirit side, we have a flesh side, we have a river running through it. We see that Govinda, the spirit, finds enlightenment through love. Now remember, I told you about who's the mind, who's the body, who's the spirit, and I'm just going to answer that question for you. So Govinda is the spirit. He finds enlightenment through love. We have Govinda bowed low. Tears, of which he knew nothing, ran down over his old face. The feeling of most intimate love, of most humble reverence, burned like a fire in his heart. So he finds enlightenment through love. Now let's go to the middle section. This is the mind. Sorry, I put body, but it should be mind. Siddartha, mind, finds enlightenment through love. On his face blossomed the serenity of knowledge, which no will opposes any longer, knowing perfection, in agreement with the flow of events, with the stream of life, full of compassion, full of sympathy, those are words for love, abandoned to the flow, belonged to unity. And notice this is connected to knowledge, the mind. Finally, we have the flesh. Kamala, which represents the body of Siddartha, finds enlightenment through love as well. You have found peace, she says. I too shall find peace. And you have found it, Siddartha spoke in a whisper. So Kamala finds enlightenment too. Now, I say that she finds it through love. We find in that chapter, that would be chapter, was it chapter 9? Yeah, chapter 9, when we meet Kamala, that we start talking about loving Kamala. He calls Kamala his love. It's the first time we've seen Kamala and love in this being used together, except of course as in terms of an action like making love. We've seen that, but in terms of saying that he's felt this passion of love for her, this is the first time. And as he's looking down in love, he says, you have found it. You have found enlightenment. Now, she's not going to find it in the same way that he's found it, and Govinda doesn't find it in the same way that he's found it, and that's because Siddartha is the mind. He's the main thing, so to speak. And so both of these have to have a finality of coming to terms with themselves, finding peace, Kamala and Govinda, within Siddartha. So now Siddartha, once Govinda becomes enlightened, we have Siddartha now being whole. His spirit and flesh have both been sanctified, if you will forgive the word. Okay. Let's look at that radiant smile. We have, and over time, his smile became more and more like that of the ferryman. It grew almost as radiant. So the ferryman has a radiant smile. Radiant, we've seen in other passages, it said in the very beginning of the book that Govinda, if Siddartha ever became a god, if he ever went into all radiance or something to that effect. So we have the idea of radiance as being perfection, enlightenment. The ferryman it grew almost as radiant as the ferryman's. It glowed nearly as blissfully, equally luminous, out of the 1,000 little folds, equally childlike, equally senile. So senile is something of the old, childlike is something of the young. So we have that duality. Just as the Buddha had happy and sad, Vasudeva has childlike and old-like, elderly, I guess I should say. Excuse me. Brightly shone Vasudeva's smile, hovering above all the wrinkles of his aged countenance, luminous, once again, of light, just as the Om hovered over all the voices of the river. So we have the idea of the smile as being Om. Brightly shone his smile when he looked at his friend, and brightly now, too, the same smile gleamed on Siddartha's face. This is Siddartha's moment of enlightenment. His womb blossomed, his pain radiated. His eye had flowed into the unity. Okay, so once again, we want to join Atman and we want to kind of get rid of ourselves. And we see that Siddartha kind of empties himself into Atman, into the thing that is all things, that inhabits everything. This is the radiant smile that Siddartha now has. Okay, now we have Govinda looking at Siddartha's face, and so Govinda saw the smile of the mask, this smile of unity above the streaming forms. Notice we have that word unity. The smile of simultaneity, that is the present, above the 1,000 births and deaths. This smile of Siddartha's was exactly the same. Tranquil, fine, impenetrable, perhaps benevolent, perhaps scornful, wise. This was the 1,000-fold smile of Gautama, of the Buddha, as he himself had beheld it with awe thousands of times. This, Govinda knew, was how the perfect ones smiled. So Siddartha is now a Buddha. And notice that we know this from the smile. So it's the lips that give us knowledge. They're not saying anything, but they're still communicating to us. For a long time he sat and looked at the face now lost in sleep. For a long time he gazed upon her mouth, the tired old mouth with narrowed lips. Okay, this is Siddartha. Sorry, I got lost in my my slides. This is Siddartha looking at the dying or dead. No, this is her. She's dying. Sorry, not dead. She's not dead yet. She's about to die. The dying Kamala. Do you remember what it said about Kamala's lips? It was like what was that fruit? Fig 4 times. Anyway, so for a long time he sat and looked at her face now lost in sleep. For a long time he gazed upon her mouth, the tired old mouth with narrowed lips. And he remembered that once in his life's springtime he had compared this mouth to a fig freshly split open. For a long time he sat reading the pale face. Okay, I'm going to stop here. The pale face, to me, reminds me of when he's in the ferryman's hut and he looks out the window and he sees the pale river, kind of red in the morning. I see the same kind of thing in my mind looking at Kamala, the pale face, the pale river, the tired creases like wrinkles on the river, filling himself with the sight. He saw his own face, just like he saw his reflection in the river, lying like that, just as white, just as extinguished, and at once saw his face and hers, young, with red lips, with burning eyes. Okay, so he's seeing both the old and the new at the same time. Isn't this what the river taught him? To see all things, all time, as the present? With burning eyes and the feeling of the present and simultaneity completely pervaded him, the feeling of eternity. Remember, the river was everywhere. We saw that was lesson number 1 of the river that I told you about. Deeply, more deeply than ever in this hour, he sensed the indestructibility of every life, the eternity of every moment. No one ever really dies, or at least when they die, they come back. They either come back to live again, or they escape the wheel of reincarnation, which is to live also. So no matter what, everyone's a winner, even though everyone will sometimes lose. Samsara, right? So eventually everyone will win. Kind of an interesting idea. All right, that was our smile motif, our lip motif. Let's look at some of the other ones. The last time we see the snake motif, it ends with a small black adder which had bitten Kamala, escaped from under her dress, and it gives her a fatal wound. It's kind of funny. What's his name? Anton Chekhov. He once said about plays, he's talking about writing a play, that if someone introduces a gun in Act 1, it better go off in Act 3. And it's kind of funny, I can't help thinking about it, that if someone introduces a snake in Triad 1, it better bite someone in Triad 3. So all this time when we've been talking about snakes, we should have realized that eventually someone's going to have to die by a snake. I just find that interesting. Anyway, Kamala, that's the last time. So the snake actually does make a transformation. It actually does represent death. It actually kills Kamala, and in doing so transforms her into an enlightened one, so to speak. She finds peace, right? Very interesting how that motif played out. And then, of course, we have the bird motif ending with the sun. The last time we talked about birds, we have the young bird referring to Siddartha Jr., the young bird, accustomed to a different life, a different nest, rebelling against his father, who himself was once like a bird in a golden cage. So Siddartha was once a bird. That was chapter 7, right? And now Siddartha has to release a bird rather than be released. So everything comes back. We see the lessons of the river being played out in these motifs. All right. We're going to end up with 2 more slides, and I want you to think about that question I asked you in session 1 about perspective. All the chapters are from Siddartha's perspective except chapters 1 and 12. That's not true. I screwed up, didn't I? Because there in chapter 7 we also have some of Kamala's voice. Okay, so let's rewrite this slide. All the chapters are from Siddartha's perspective except chapters 1, 7, and 12. Chapter 1 is from both Siddartha's and Govinda's perspective. Chapter 7 has some of Kamala's perspective. And chapter 12 is entirely from Govinda's perspective. Okay, so, and this is an example of where we saw Govinda's perspective from chapter 1, just so we remember. No, nor did he, Govinda, want to be one among 10,000 Brahmins. He wanted to follow his beloved, his magnificent Siddartha, and if ever Siddartha were to become a god, if he were to arrive among the radiant, then Govinda wanted to follow him as his friend, his companion, as his servant, his spearman, his shadow, right? And you remember what I was saying in chapter 7, that wasn't too far ago, when Kamala was releasing the songbird. That part is from her perspective. Now, here's the question. Why is there different perspectives in these 3 chapters? Is there a symbolic reason? And you should know the reason by now. If you don't know the reason, what am I going to do with you? Because it's so clear, right? As a matter of fact, if you don't know the reason, go back and review this session, because I kind of say it without telling you what I'm saying. Anyway, trace Govinda and the Buddha's monks' journey. Okay, so trace their journey. Throw Kamala in there too, please. Where have they been? Think about this. Where have Govinda and the monks been? Did they always stay on the spirit side? Because they're spirit people. If not, where did they go? And why? Again, I want the spiritual or the symbolic reason, not necessarily the book reason. Does you understand what I'm asking? I'm asking you to do some meta thinking here. Where do they go and why? And the answer to this question might make a great way to conclude an AP essay about Siddartha, depending on the topic. So in order for you to show that you've truly learned something about the book, sometimes you can use that concluding paragraph to kind of make a point that's attached to your topic, but also kind of shows a greater understanding of the book, right? You want to try to impress your reader as much as you can. We will talk about doing that in the class, okay? There is a purpose for that concluding paragraph. At any rate, that's the book Siddartha. It's one of my favorite books. I read it in high school. I've read it maybe, 20 times. I love it. I've read it with you this year, and I actually learned something new about it. I think it's one of the greatest books ever written. And I hope that you feel the same, or at least you can understand the beauty of it and why I chose it for you.